Hey y'all, it's Angela. I'm very glad to have you here today. So, we've come to the end of February, and traditionally, February has been a pretty good reading month for me, and this year was no different. I managed to get through 23 books this month, which is absolutely insane. But I'm really excited to bring you some different selections that are maybe slightly out of my normal reading and introduce some books that maybe y'all haven't heard of. So, let's just jump straight into it. The first two books I wanted to talk about are part of a romance series. This is the Written in the Stars series by Alexandria Bellefleur. The first book is Written in the Stars and it follows Darcy and Elle. They go on this first date that's set up by Darcy's brother and it's absolutely disastrous. It's a terrible first date. But Darcy, who has been kind of burned by a past relationship, has been really tired of getting set up on blind dates. So when her brother continues to try to set her up on more dates, she decides that she is going to convince Elle to fake date so that both of them can get respective families, friends off their backs. But as they meet up more, there's a spark that develops between them that they just can't deny. What starts off initially as fake dating turns into something more real. This book is definitely for my astrology gals out there. So the main character, Elle, she runs this astrology Twitter account, and it's like one of those meme astrology Twitter accounts. So if you're into astrology, if you really like the fake dating trope, or you're just looking for like a really sweet queer romance, this would definitely be an excellent one to pick up. And then I also read the second book in the series, which is Hang the Moon, and this follows Darcy's brother Brendan, who has always been in love with Darcy's friend Annie since he was like in high school when they first met. But Annie has been traveling a lot for her job and they really haven't seen each other in 8 years. However, Annie comes back to visit Darcy one more time before making this big move to London, and there's just insta sparks between Brendan and Annie still. And Brendan decides that he's going to appoint himself as Annie's tour guide to Seattle. This book is very reminiscent of your classic rom-com. It's set in this vibrant city. You have a character, Brendan, who is in love with the idea of love and happily ever afters for everyone. And then you have Annie, who has definitely been hurt a little bit in the past and is just not really into relationships at the moment. This book, Hang the Moon, is definitely more of like a friends to lovers trope or kind of like a second chance romance kind of trope. Both books are actually quite steamy and also have great conversations, especially in Hang the Moon. I ended up giving both books 4 stars. The next book was definitely a very anticipated read for me from 2021 and it is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This book is about a man who wakes up in a spaceship with no memories of how he's got there or what his name is or anything that's happened to him. He sees that he is the only survivor in this spaceship and he has to slowly piece together his memory and what's going on around him to figure out what his purpose there in the spaceship is. Andy Weir really has a talent of making science fiction feel accessible to a really wide audience. And he goes into such detail and manages to kind of summarize the main points that you as a reader should take away well enough that you really don't need to be super scientific or into science fiction to have a good time reading this book. Plus, there's so many humorous moments. His main characters always have a very dry sense of humor and love injecting little kind of comedic moments here and there. And especially in this book where, I won't spoil it, but about halfway through you get this very big reveal. And the situations that arise from that reveal were so interesting, really funny, and I absolutely enjoyed reading this book. The only thing I was really missing from this book was the tension in the plot towards the end. We get to kind of the climax of the book and then the end just kind of like drops off a little bit. It's very hurried through when I would have maybe liked a little bit more focus or development, like maybe shifting around the pacing from the middle to the end of the book to give the end a little bit more time just to simmer just a little bit more. Overall, great book, would highly recommend, and I gave this 4 stars. Next, I read another series. I know, who is she? But I read the first 2 books from the Finlay Donovan series, and the first book was Finlay Donovan is Killing It. This book follows Finlay. She's an author and she's also recently got divorced, so she's kind of juggling the responsibilities of taking care of her kids while also advancing her career. But she really doesn't have a lot of resources, both time and money, readily available to her. So one day, she's in this Panera Bread just talking about the plot of her romantic suspense novel with her agent, and this woman overhears and accidentally thinks that Finlay is actually a killer for hire. So this woman hires Finlay to kill her husband for like an exorbitant amount of money, I think maybe $50,000, and Finlay obviously doesn't really have the skill sets for it, doesn't really want to do it, but she really, really needs the money. While this book is a mystery suspense novel, it's so lighthearted and fun. Finlay is a character that just gets herself into the craziest situations. Like, you cannot believe that she makes these decisions that gets her in these places, but she does, and things happen, and it's just a really fun book. The second book is Finlay, Donovan Knocks Him Dead, and it continues to follow Finlay's story where she's investigating into this case where someone out there wants her ex-husband dead, and she has to figure out who it is because she doesn't really want, the father of her children to get murdered. I can't really say much about the plot for fear of spoilers for the first book, but the second book is just as fun. It's even crazier at some points, but you do get the feeling that this series is setting itself up for this very big plot in the later books. So the second book is kind of where you start this like more overarching plot, and so it doesn't have as much of that fast, kind of fun, energetic feel as the first book, but it is just as light and kind of heartwarming in places, and there's also some romance in there more in the second book than the first. But yes, very fun books to read. I gave these both 5 stars. The next book I read was The Maid by Nita Prose, and this book follows our main character Molly, who is a maid working at this very fancy hotel. And one day when she goes into work, she finds a dead man in a hotel room. Now, Molly struggles a little bit with social interactions, and so during her interrogation with the police, she comes off just suspicious enough that the police put her as their prime suspect. So she has to clear her name and find out who actually killed the man. This was one of my most anticipated books of 2022, and I ended up absolutely loving it. With this one, it really is more of a contemporary novel with a little bit of like a mystery intrigue, which is kind of right up my alley, and everything about Molly and her life and her relationship with her grandmother, her developing friendships, all of them just made her so endearing to me. I love Molly as a character, and I listened to this through audiobook, which I really would highly recommend. The narrator for this audiobook is absolutely fantastic, and it really got inside Molly's head and got her voice so right that it was just amazing. And as you can guess, I gave this book 5 stars. Next, I read The Roughest Draft by Emily Wibberley and Austin Sigmund Broca. This book is about 2 authors who wrote this huge best-selling book together, but right after finishing the first book, something happened between them and they haven't spoken since. It's been 3 years now, and they still are contracted with their publisher to do 1 more book, and neither of them are really succeeding in their own writing careers or writing journeys, so they decide that they're just going to knock this last book out just so that they can be done with each other. They go back to the same town and even the same house that they wrote their first book in, and even though tensions are very high at first, slowly things get revealed from their past as to what happened between them and why they haven't spoken to each other in 3 years. This was also an anticipated book for me, but unfortunately it just didn't really work out. There were a lot of elements in the book that I personally don't like in romances, so much so that it really ruined the whole relationship for me. What I can say is that the writing style is really beautiful, and the character development and the pacing of it especially was really well done. I think it's pretty difficult to pace good romantic tension between characters, and these 2 authors in this book did it absolutely fantastically. I do feel like I need to let y'all know, and some people might consider this a spoiler, so if you don't want to know anything about this book, you can skip to the next book. This book does involve emotional cheating in the main relationship, and so if that's something that you don't really like and you don't like relationships built off of cheating of any kind, this might not be the romance for you. Mainly because of the way the relationship was developed and the reasons behind how they got together, I gave this book 3 stars. The next book I read was The Red Palace by June Her. This is another historical mystery suspense novel from the author, and it follows the main character Hyun, who is a palace nurse. She's suddenly thrown to a lot of court politics when 4 young women get murdered in the palace, and so she's working with the main police investigator to kind of figure out who could be behind these heinous murders. This is another fantastic historical novel from June Her. I think she's really nailed this mystery suspense kind of genre within Korean history. I love the combination of the 2. The only thing I didn't love was the plot in the first third kind of dragged a little bit, so it was quite difficult to get into the plot and to connect with the characters and to be invested in what's going on. But the last half absolutely moves, and you actually get a lot of good character development along with plot development, which was something that I felt was a step up from her first book, The Silence of the Bones. If you love historical K-dramas, you'll absolutely love this book. If you are kind of iffy about historical fiction, I think you should give this book a try, because I'm definitely not a historical fiction girly. I don't really like historical fiction, but everything from Junher that I've read so far has been really engrossing and has had that extra kick in the plot that most historical fiction lack for me. I gave this book 4 stars. The next book I read was Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. I think you could consider this a novella-length book. It starts out with the main character, Sophia. She lives in this perfect house with a perfect life, with a perfect husband, and then one kind of tiny crack appears and she starts questioning her entire world. This is one of those books where I really can't tell you anything about the plot, because the way it gets unveiled and the way you figure out what is really going on is so good, so perfect. I loved the voice that the author wrote with, and I also liked the imagery and just the very lyricalness of it. Once things start clicking, you will not be able to put this book down, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Next, I read The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This book is set on an island off the coast of Ireland, and there's a wedding happening there, and all these people get invited to the wedding, and it's supposed to be this beautiful, great, happy event, but then a murder happens, and somebody on the island is responsible. This was my first Lucy Foley book. I've been wanting to read her for a long time, and I really wasn't disappointed. I liked that we had a lot of different points of views. We had kind of a past and present thing. There were a lot of twists, and all the characters obviously had something to do with each other. They all knew each other in some ways, even if it's not apparent at the first glance. If you like those kind of closed-in mysteries where the murderer is in one place and you have this group of people and everyone is kind of hiding some sort of secret, but you slowly figure it out one by one, this book will definitely be for you. I had a great time reading it and I gave it 4 stars. The next books were quite random picks. They're a little bit of a throwback, and it was the Willoughbys series. The Willoughbys has kind of a special place in my heart. It was one of my favorite childhood books, and recently I did a video where I played a game of Wordle every day and used that word to give book recommendations. I'll leave that video linked somewhere here. But for one of the recommendations, I recommended the Willoughbys. So starting with the Willoughbys, you follow this family where it's a mom and a dad and 3 kids. The kids hate the parents and the parents hate the kids, and they're both simultaneously trying to get rid of each other, and they kind of get into a lot of shenanigans because of it. This book is very tongue-in-cheek, and it kind of parodies a lot of quote-unquote old-fashioned stories. So they talk a lot about how can we be old-fashioned children, and old-fashioned children would do this and not this. I think this book is pretty timeless. I enjoyed it even as an adult, and of course I gave it 5 stars again. I think this book is definitely one of those that if you have kids, if you have younger readers in your life, this would be a great one to gift. It's just so fun. And then I read the Willoughbys Return, which is the second book that came out in 2020, I think, so quite a while after the first book. And this basically follows the parents who originally were stuck on this mountain at the end of the first book. They unfroze and they are coming back to their old town like 30 years after the events of the first book. So their kids have all grown up, but the parents haven't. And so you're following the kids of the kids in the first book. I think the magic of the first book was definitely lost in the second. There wasn't as much of that kind of like breaking the fourth wall, that kind of tongue-in-cheek humor. It was a lot of trying to reference modern day pop culture things as the humorous moments, which that's one thing I don't love in books. Did I love the new characters that were introduced? Not really. I don't think they were as charming as the people from the first book. In fact, I missed the characters from the first book. I kind of wanted to see how they were living their lives as adults. I think that would have been an interesting continuation of the first book. Ultimately, maybe it's just because the first book holds a lot of nostalgia for me that I loved it so much, but the second book wasn't really written for my audience, I don't think, and I gave it 2 stars. Next, I read the 4th volume in the Heartstopper series, and the Heartstopper series follows 2 boys, Charlie and Nick. They're in high school, and they start off as friends. They're kind of in different social circles, so it's a little bit strange that they develop this very strong friendship, but as they get to know each other more, this friendship develops into something a little bit stronger and a little bit more like romance. Not sure if I made it obvious enough or not, but I absolutely love the characters in this book, all of them, not just the 2 main characters. I love every single one of the side characters as well, and I think that's what Alice Oseman does really good in all of her books, is that she takes each character and turns them into like a fully fleshed person, so you really feel connected to each character's story. And these two go through some very cute moments, but also some very serious, tough moments about growing up, and they do go through some growing pains, but they do it together, which makes it a really kind of wholesome experience. The fourth volume was also really great. I'm going to keep picking these up as they come out, and I gave it 5 stars. The next book I read was Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson, and it follows a woman who, as a favor to her best friend from high school, becomes this nanny figure to 2 children from this woman's husband's previous marriage. Now, these 2 children are a bit peculiar in that whenever they get too overstimulated or feel too strong of emotions, they start on fire, they ignite. And that's a big issue, not only that these children, start on fire, but also that their dad is this important senator. So they have to kind of keep things under wraps. No one can know that the senator has these 2 kids that literally burst into flames. I've had my eye on this book for a while. The premise is just like nothing I've ever heard of before, and I think getting through it, it was okay. The writing style was really what kind of detracted the most from my enjoyment of this book. I think it was a little bit too dry and a little bit too detached for my liking. The kids were great. I love getting to know the kids, although some really, really terrible things happen to them that just kind of get thrown in there almost for shock value, which I'm still kind of grappling with how I feel about that. But I love the kids and how they were introduced. The plot of the book was also kind of just okay. We were getting somewhere near the end of the book, but then things devolved a little too quickly. Things get wrapped up a little too suddenly. I gave it 3 stars because I enjoyed most of it. I think I could see some people finding this humorous, finding this really enjoyable or kind of, cozy, but I think for me this was just a little bit too much of nothing for me to truly enjoy it. The next book I read was one that I didn't think I would ever finish just because I feel like I've kind of sworn off Sarah J. Maas for a long time, but I ended up finishing House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. It's in the Crescent City series, and of course it's because the second book, House of Sky and Breath, got released a few weeks ago that I decided, you know what, I'm gonna jump on the hype, I'm gonna finish this book. This book is a lot, but to kind of sum it up simply, it's set in this world where there's a lot of fantastical creatures, and you're following the main character, Bryce, whose best friend gets murdered under mysterious circumstances, and she and this fallen angel named Hunt have to work together to figure out who was behind the murder. One of my friends absolutely loves this book. This is actually her copy that she lent me, and I kind of, got into the hype to see what was going on because of her. And so she was kind of telling me all about how crazy and heart-pounding and thrilling everything this book was, and so I was kind of intrigued. I picked it up, and I have to say this book for me is a little bit hard to judge just because I think what I loved about it was not at all the romance between Bryce and Hunt, which actually takes up quite a large part of the plot. Most of this chonker of a book is really just kind of conversations and relationship development between them, and those were parts that I really wasn't invested in. I don't really love the way that Hunt is structured as a character. He gives off kind of alpha male vibes that is just like not my preference. So the romance wasn't really what did it for me. It was actually more of like the mystery kind of suspense intrigue that made me stick around for this book. The investigation, though it was thorough, did feel pretty repetitive at times. It just felt like we were following Bryce and Hunt going to all these different places and getting like either nothing or just like crumbs of clues, which was kind of frustrating. But the last maybe like fourth of the book was, how do I even explain it? I'm not even sure how to put it into words. There were just so many twists and reveals, and certainly the author knows how to write a heart-wrenching scene because I did shed a few tears at the very end. So I think this book, while it was really fun, definitely had some parts that I wish would have been kind of edited or kind of taken out. I'm not sure at all where the second book is going because this in and of itself was enough for like a 3-book series. So I'm kind of interested in seeing where the second book takes the plot, but I ended up giving this book 4 stars. These next 3 books were advanced reader copies that I had requested, so thank you very much to the publishers for sending me these books. The next book I read was A Brush with Love by Maisie Eddings, and this book follows the main character Harper. She is a dental school student, and she has very high aspirations of going into oral surgery after graduating, which is very different from most of the people around her who want to go more into family dentistry. She's very high achieving, she's very motivated, and She also struggles a lot with her mental health, especially when it comes to her anxiety. One day, she has the misfortune of falling down a flight of stairs and she crashes right into Dan, who is a first-year dental student. He's definitely not into dentistry as much as Harper is. He's there more out of familial obligation, and after this incident where they kind of crash into each other, they start this relationship where they're both, very intrigued with each other. There's sparks flying, romance developing. It's a romance. I think this book really jumped out because I'd never seen a romance set among like dentists or like in dental school. And I think that the character individually were developed really well, but I didn't really have an investment into the relationship itself. They kind of meet immediately and it's almost like insta-love. This book did tackle a wide variety of topics outside of the romance, for example, like sexism in the medical community, mental health, and how stressful dental school can be on its students. And I think while those topics were done well, they were almost competing for a spot with the romance in the books at times. I also wish that there was just a little bit more character work done for the side characters. A lot of them seem to be there just to support the main characters. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. The next book I read was Tell Me an Ending by Joe Harkins, and this is set in the near future where this company, Nepenthe, has developed technology to selectively remove memories. We're following 5 points of views that are all kind of adjacent to this memory deletion technology, and we're seeing how it affects these people in their daily lives and how it kind of ripples out to affect their friends and their families. I really enjoyed reading this book, though it definitely has less of a science fiction-y feel than I was hoping for. It focuses more on each person's lives and uncovering their usually kind of hidden past. As you move through the plot, you also see how these 5 points of views intertwine and how their stories are all semi-interconnected, and the ending really did give a pretty powerful message. I enjoyed reading the book. It was just a little bit different than what I was expecting. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I read was The Resting Place by Camilla Sten. This book follows the main character Eleanor, who has prosopagnosia, which is more commonly known as face blindness, and a few months ago, she had witnessed her grandmother's murder, and she had even caught the murderer, but she couldn't remember the murderer's face, and they got away. Now in the present, Eleanor is going to this estate that her grandmother had kept a secret to kind of sort out the assets, and she's going there with her boyfriend, the lawyer that's dividing up the assets, and her aunt. While there, she uncovers secrets about the family's past and about her grandmother that shed more light on who the murderer was. This is a really great kind of claustrophobic, snowed-in mystery suspense. It's set on this remote estate in the dead of winter. They're surrounded by this snowstorm, and you feel like this house is not safe. There's something in it. There's something restless about it. The twist did kind of come out of nowhere, so I'm not sure if I enjoyed that as much as part of the plot. And the first third kind of dragged a little bit. Eleanor as a main character is quite unreliable, and from her point of view, everything seems disproportionately scarier than it actually is. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I read was Space Opera by Catherine M. Valente, and this is about this intergalactic space music festival that Earth is kind of forced into participating in, otherwise their species gets recognized as not sentient and they get destroyed. It follows this has-been pop star who has to kind of gather the rest of his band to go perform, and it kind of delves into the vastness of the galaxies and all these different aliens and other civilizations, and also within this guy's past and his life. This book is very weird. It's one of the weirdest things I've read. It reminds me of that Rick and Morty episode where those floating heads come to Earth and like force them to participate in that music competition. It's like if you combine that episode with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah, I think that's the best approximation of this book. I picked this up mainly because I really like the way the author wrote Comfort Me with Apples. I like the writing style, so I figured this might be an interesting one to give it a try, but it's a completely different writing style in this book compared to her other one. This one has a much more emphasis on adjectives and just randomness, and it's very dense in the not good way. So I ended up giving this book 2 stars. Next, I read People Like Them by Samira Sadira, and this is set in a snowy French village, a very small town where everyone kind of knows each other, and this new family moves in. They're flashy, they're rich, and they get into a little bit of a tense situation with their neighbors. It's got elements of suspense, but it's definitely more of a contemporary book with commentary on race and social class. This reminds me a lot of Leave the World Behind, and I think if you like the tone of that book, you'll really enjoy this one. I gave this one 5 stars. I think the length and the pacing was just perfect for this story. The next book I read was The Dating Plan by Sarah Desai. This follows a main character, Daisy, who really isn't interested in getting married even though her family has been pushing her and setting her up with arranged marriages. And then we have Liam, who has recently received this inheritance that is contingent on him being married. Now, Daisy and Liam have a long history. Liam was Daisy's brother's best friend, and they had this fight that kind of really ruined the relationship between them. But when they've grown up and they happen to meet at this tech conference, they realize that both of their situations make for a beneficial fake marriage situation. So that's what happens. I think I had a similar issue with this book as I did with A Brush with Love, in that there wasn't quite enough tension building between the two characters in their relationship for me to really become invested with it long term. While I did really love Daisy's family, they were so fun, and I think that all the scenes between her and her very nosy aunts were amazing. I just think that the actual relationship itself I just wasn't totally invested in, so I ended up giving this book 3 stars. Next book I read was They Never Learned by Lane Fargo, and this follows a professor at this university who is secretly a serial killer, and she only targets men who have either physically or verbally harmed women. And so she has kind of kept this under wraps for the past decade, but one particular murder has kind of put all of that in danger. Simultaneously, we're also following the point of view of a student named Carly. She's come to university for her first year. She's kind of shy, but she absolutely loves literature and reading and writing. She becomes friends with her roommate, who is the complete opposite of her, this very out there theater major. But something happens to her roommate that dramatically affects her life and also the rest of Carly's life. A lot of people I'm following have absolutely raved about this book, and I think it wasn't until I really got into it that I kind of understood what the hype was about. The mystery suspense component was really well done, well paced, and I think the twist, even if you can see it, doesn't detract from the fun of the story. This was one of the most fun mystery suspense that I read in a while, and you really get that sense of justice even if it's kind of done through wrong means. The final book I read was Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson. This is about 2 people who meet in this London pub and they fall in love. While this is a love story, it's not necessarily just a love story between these 2 people. It's more of this love letter to Black artists, musicians, writers. It's an account of the experience of being Black and living in a racist society. And it's about finding a way to live your life when it seems like everything in the world is set out against you. This was a really beautifully written book and such an amazing debut. I think that it was just a little bit dense and maybe kind of wavering in terms of the point and the plot towards the end. I gave this book ultimately 4 stars. I would say definitely check it out. It is just such a beautiful book. And those were all the books that I read in the month of February. Another very long wrap up. But please let me know in the comments down below what were some of your favorites and least favorite books from the month. I would love to hear from you. If you would like to be friends on other places on the internet, I have my Goodreads, Instagram, and Storygraph linked in the description, along with a document of trigger warnings / content warnings for the books I've talked about in today's video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.